Pleasant greetings. I am Siti Shayani Macarimbang, and in this presentation, I will try to discuss the answers on Chapter 4 and questions. For problem 4-1, we will try to identify if the statements are true or false. So for problem 4-1, question number 1, all revenues shall be remitted to the Bureau of Treasury and included in a special fund unless another law specifically requires otherwise. So this statement is false. Unless otherwise specifically provided by law, all revenues accruing to an entity by virtue of the provisions of existing law, order, and regulations shall be remitted to the National Treasury and not the Bureau of Treasury. Also, all revenues shall be included in the general fund of the government and hindi siya sa special fund. So saka lang siya included sa special fund only when authorized by law and by following such rules and regulations as may be issued by the permanent committee. For question number 2, payments to government entities in the form of checks are not allowed. So number 2 is also false because collecting officers shall accept payment in the form of checks upon proper endorsement and identification of the payee or endorsee. So number 2 is false. For number 3, revenues of a government entity arise from exchange transactions only. So obviously this is false kasi the Philippine Public Sector Accounting Standards or the PPSAS 9 states that revenues to be received by the national government agencies may arise from exchange transactions and non-exchange transactions. So exchange transactions or reciprocal transaction are those transactions where one entity receives assets or services or has liabilities extinguished and directly gives approximately an equal value to another entity as an exchange. Common example nito is yung sale of goods and rendering of services. So kapag naman non-exchange or non-reciprocal transaction, yung isang entity receives from another entity but does not give approximately equal value as an exchange kasi from the word itself, non-exchange. So some examples include payment of taxes, fines, and other or like penalties. So number 4, according to the GAM for NGAs, revenue from exchange transactions are measured at the amount of cash received. So this is false. Rather than measuring at the amount of cash received, the PPSAS 23 provides that revenues arising from exchange transactions shall be measured at the fair value of the consideration received or receivable. So number 4 is false kasi hindi siya sa amount of cash received based since it shall be measured at the fair value of the consideration received. For number 5, when cash flows are deferred, the fair value of the consideration receivable is its present value. So this is true. So take note na if the cash flows are deferred, then the fair value of the consideration received might be less than its nominal account. So if deferred siya, then we will discount all the future cash flows using an imputed interest rate. So we will recognize an interest revenue that is equal to the difference between the fair value of the consideration and its nominal account. So for question number 6, the constructive remittance of taxes withheld through the TRA gives rise to the recognition of revenue. So number 6 is true. So in a non-exchange transaction, revenues are recognized on a cash basis until a reliable measurement model is developed. Since cash basis siya, then we will recognize revenue when we actually receive or collect it or when it is measurable and legally collectible. So, in this statement, nasabi niya, constructive remittance of taxes withheld are recognized as revenue. So, this is true. Then, question number 7. According to the GAM for NGAs, the receipt of concessionary loans by government entities may give rise to revenue recognition. Concessionary loans are those loans that are received by the entity at below the market terms. So, hindi siya agad ma-recognize as revenue. So, kailangan muna ng entity na i-determine if yung difference between the transaction price and the fair value of the loan in initial recognition is a non-exchange transaction. So, kapag non-exchange transaction siya, kapag non-exchange transaction yung difference, then saka lang siya makakapag-recognize ng revenue unless a present obligation exists. So number 7 is true. Now for question number 8, the taxable event for income tax is the passage of time period for which the tax is levied. So this is false because the taxable event for income tax is the earning of taxable income and hindi yung passage of time period from which the tax is levied. So number 8 is false. Then number 9, taxes are compulsory payments imposed on persons, properties, or activities intended to provide revenue to the government. So taxes include fees, fines, and penalties. Now, it is true na taxes are compulsory payments in order to provide revenue to the government. But taxes do not include fees, fines, and penalties kasi yung fines and penalties are monetary sanctions imposed as a consequence of breach of law and regulation and may separate siya na discussion in the GAM for NGAs, so it is not considered as tax. So that is why number 9 is false. And then the last question for problem 4-1, the main source of revenue for the government is taxes. So obviously, this statement is true. So yes, taxes are the main source of revenue for the government. So that is all for problem 4-1. Now we move on to the problem 4-2 multiple choice theoretical questions. So we have number 1, which of the following is a non-exchange transaction? Letter A, leasing. Letter B, collection of taxes. Letter C, rendering of legal services. And letter D, collection of tuition fees. So the correct answer is letter B, collection of taxes. So we've already learned that payment of tax is a non-exchange transaction because taxes are received without directly providing something with approximately equal value in exchange. So for question number 1, the answer is letter B. Number 2, entity A enters into a long-term contract to provide services. The outcome of the transaction can be estimated reliably, and the progress on the contract can be measured with sufficient reliability. According to the PPSAS, how should entity A recognize revenue from the contract? So letter A, on a straight line basis over the contract term. Letter B, by reference to the stage of completion of the contract at the reporting date. Letter C, full recognition of contract prices upon completion of the contract. And D, only to the extent of costs that are expected to be recovered. So the right answer is letter B, by reference to the stage of completion of the contract at the reporting date. So when rendering services, revenue is recognized by reference to the stage of completion if the outcome of the transaction can be estimated reliably, such as when all of the following conditions are satisfied. So these 4 conditions must be satisfied. First, when the completion stage at the reporting date can be measured reliably. Next, when it is probable that economic benefits will flow to the entity, when the revenue can be measured reliably, and when the cost relating to the transaction can be measured reliably. So number 2 is letter B. Now for number 3, according to the GAM for NGAs, interest revenue is recognized A, on a time proportion basis using effective interest method, B, on a straight line basis, C, in accordance with the substance of the relevant loan agreement, D, when the entity's right to receive payment is established. So the correct answer is letter A, on a time proportion basis using effective interest method. So if we remember, interest revenue is recognized if there is a difference in the fair value of the consideration received and its nominal amount. So we will recognize interest revenue on a time proportion basis using an effective interest rate. Next, question number 4. The taxable event for the value-added tax or VAT is the A, undertaking of a taxable activity, B, earning of taxable income, C, movement of dutiable goods or services across the customs boundary, and D, any of these. So the answer is letter A. So the taxable event for the VAT is the undertaking of a taxable entity. So letter B is not the answer because it is actually the taxable income for taxable event for income taxes. So letter C is also wrong because it is the taxable event for custom duties. So the right answer is letter A. And then number 5, Which of the following would result to an increase or decrease in the revenue reported by a government entity in its statement of financial performance? A. Impairment loss on an amount already recognized as revenue. B. Receipt of pledge. C. Receipt of donation in the form of services in kind. And D. The repayment of a loan payable is forgiven. So the right answer is letter D. The repayment of a loan payable is forgiven because this will result to a recognition of revenue amounting to the carrying amount of the debt that is forgiven. So letters A, B, and C are not correct because they are not usually recognized as revenue since these three do not meet the recognition criteria for asset. So for number 5, letter D is the correct answer. Next, number 6, it is a rare type of fund held by government entity that is designated for special purposes. A. General fund. B. Special fund. C. Trust fund. And D. Fiduciary fund. So the answer for this is letter B. Special fund is a fund that is designated only for special purposes. General fund pertains to those that is available for any purpose other than those which other funds have been designated to, while trust and fiduciary fund is held by government agency or public officer acting as a trustee, agent, or administrator. So special fund is the right answer. Then number 7, the national government receives a foreign grant conditioned on the construction of a public infrastructure. According to the GAM for NGAs, when does the national government recognize revenue from the grant? So A, upon receipt of the grant. B, when the grant becomes receivable, provided there is reasonable assurance that the attached condition will be satisfied. C, when the condition is met. And D, when the related expenses for which the grant is intended to compensate are incurred. So for number 7, letter C is the answer. According to the GAM for NGAs, grants with conditions are recognized initially as a liability and then subsequently recognized revenue when the conditions attached to the grant are satisfied. So it does not recognize revenue until the condition is satisfied and the liability is recognized. Then number 8. So the receipt of which of the following may not give rise to revenue by a government entity? A. Notice of cash allocation. B. Tax remittance advice. C. Subsidy from another government entity. D. Interagency fund transfer. So among the choices, letter D or the interagency fund transfer does not give rise to revenue. So the receipt of notice of cash allocation, tax remittance advice, and subsidy from another government entity all requires the recognition of revenue. So for number 8, the correct answer is letter D. Now for number 9, so a government entity collects fees for the processing of certain permits. The processing of a permit would normally take a few minutes. So the processing fee is collected upon issuance of the permit. This government entity would normally recognize revenue from permit fees, letter A, on a straight line basis, letter B, by reference to the stage of completion, letter C, upon collection of the fee, letter D, when the significant risk and rewards are transferred to the customer. So for this question, the answer is letter C. So we know that fees received is a non-exchange transaction, and take note that in the case of non-exchange transaction, the cash basis is used when recognizing a revenue. So that is why the receipt of permit fees will be recognized as a revenue upon its collection. So number 9 is letter C. So for number 10, the receipt of a performance bond or a security deposit is credited to A. Liability account, B. Revenue account, C. Cash account, and D. A and C. So the correct answer is liability account. So that ends the problem 4-2. So we will move on to problem 4-3 for classroom discussion. Under problem 4-3, the first question, which of the following is not one of the fundamental principles for revenue under PD number 1445? A. All revenues shall be remitted to the Bureau of Treasury and included in the general fund unless another law specifically allows otherwise. B. Recording of revenue and other types of funds shall be made only when authorized by law. C. Collections of revenue shall be properly acknowledged through pre-numbered official receipts. D. All collections of revenue must be in the form of cash, so checks are not acceptable. So among these choices, letter D is not one of the fundamental principles for revenue under the GAM for NGAs. So collections of revenue can be made in the form of checks. So number one is letter D. For number two, imposition and collection of tax revenue is considered A. Exchange transaction, B. Non-exchange transaction, C. Donation, and D. Any of these. So the correct answer is letter B. So non-exchange transaction. So we've already learned that, and I think there's no need to discuss it further. So imposition and collection of tax revenue is considered an exchange transaction. We move on to the third question. According to the GAM for NGAs, all of the following criteria must be met before a government entity recognizes revenue from sale of goods except A. Significant risk and rewards of ownership of the goods are transferred to the buyer and the entity does not retain control over those goods. Letter B. It is probable that economic benefits will flow to the entity. Letter C. The amounts of revenue and related costs can be measured reliably. And letter D, the stage of completion can be measured reliably. So the answer for this question is letter D, which is the stage of completion can be measured reliably. So the first three choices have to be satisfied first in order for the recognition of revenue from sale of goods. Whereas letter D doesn't have to be met since it will only apply and is only required for the revenue recognition for rendering of services. Now, for number 4, according to the GAM for NGAs, when the outcome of a service contract cannot be estimated reliably, revenue is recognized A. On a straight line basis over the periods the services are rendered, B. By reference to the contract stage of completion at each reporting date, C. Only to the extent of costs that are expected to be recovered, and D. Only upon the completion of the contract. So, the right answer is letter C. So according to the PPSAS, when the outcome of the transaction involved in the rendering of services cannot be estimated reliably, then the revenue is recognized only to the extent of the expenses recognized that are recoverable. So 4 is letter C. Then number 5, entity A sells goods with a list price of 100,000 on account. The credit term is 20% and 10%. The journal entry to recognize the revenue includes all of the following except A. A debit to accounts receivable for 72,000, B. A credit to sales revenue for 72,000, and C. A debit to sales discount for 28,000, and D. All of these are included in the entry. So the answer for this question is letter C. So the journal entry for this question is a debit to accounts receivable amounting to 72,000 and a credit to sales revenue for 72,000. So this 72K is calculated by deducting the credit terms discount from the list price. So there's no need to recognize a debit to sales discount of 28,000. So number 5, the correct answer is letter C, a debit to sales discount for 28,000. So we're now down to question number 6. So according to the GAM for NGAs, an exchange of goods or services of similar nature and value between entities, A. Gives rise to revenue measured at the fair value of the goods or services received, adjusted for any cash paid or received on the exchange. B. Gives rise to revenue measured at the fair value of the goods or services given up, adjusted for any cash paid or received on the exchange. So letter C, A, or B, whichever is more clearly determinable. And letter D does not give rise to revenue. So the correct answer is letter D. According to the GAM for NGAs, when goods or services are exchanged or swapped for goods and services which are of a similar nature and value, the exchange is not regarded as a transaction which generates revenue. So for number 6, letter D is the right answer. Seventh question. Gifts, donations, and goods in kind with condition are recognized, letter A, as revenue immediately upon the receipt thereof, letter B, initially as liability and recognized as revenue only when the condition is satisfied, letter C, as revenue measured at fair value only when actually received, and letter D, directly in equity. So for number 7, the answer for this one is letter B. So grants with conditions are initially recognized as liability and then revenue are recognized only when the conditions are met. So I guess I've already discussed this earlier. So number 7 answer is letter B. Then number 8, according to the GAM for NGAs, which of the following may never give rise to revenue for a government entity? A. Services in kind. B. Debt forgiveness. C. Concessionary loan. D. Grant with condition. Debt forgiveness, concessionary loan, and grant with condition are transactions that generates revenue. So letter A, or the services in kind, is the only one that doesn't give rise to revenue. That is why for number 8, the answer to number 8 is letter A, services in kind. So second to the last question, when an amount already recognized as revenue becomes subsequently uncollectible, it is A, recognized as expense, B, recognized as an adjustment to the revenue originally recognized, C, either A or B as an accounting policy choice, and D, not recognized. So letter A is the answer for this question. So when it becomes subsequently uncollectible, then we have to recognize an expense, which is the impairment loss, instead of making adjustments to the revenue that was initially recognized as such. So the GAM for NGAs provides that there should be an evaluation for the collectibility of accounts receivable on an ongoing basis based on the historical bad debts, customer creditworthiness, and other considerations. And an allowance shall be recognized for those known and estimated bad debts. So for number 9, the answer is letter A. Now we're down to the last question. Which of the following receipts of a government entity will give rise to revenue recognition? A. Receipt of excess cash advance. Letter B. Receipt of refund for overpayment of expenses. Letter C. Receipt of performance bond. And letter D. Receipt of subsidy from the national government or other national government agencies. So the correct answer is letter D, which is the receipt of subsidy from the national government or other NGAs. So the rest of the choices will not result in the recognition of revenue. So letter D is recognized as revenue from assistance and subsidy. So that is all for my presentation on the discussion of the answers to Chapter 4 and questions. Again, I am Siti Shayani Macarimbang of ACT 132 Section VB. Thank you.